you have written for many years about how terrible is the fiscal situation of Japan,
Mhm. Yes,
and that cannot continue.
right.
But
And
so
I've
far, it's
been wrong.
continued. Yeah,
Yes.
actually, it feels a bit like I remember that when I was on the job market, we're talking about
Right.
the winter of '92.
Mm.
Everybody was asking about Italy and whether the fiscal situation of Italy was feasible, and I was saying no,
Mhm.
and people said, "Oh, but so far so good." And I use the
Yeah.
metaphor that when you jump out of a high rise, the first 20 floors are fine. Is when you arrive at the end that you get, uh, and, uh, and I was actually vindicated, unfortunately, because in the summer of '92, Italy had a major crisis. So I think
Yeah.
eventually will come. But why don't you tell us why you're being worried and why you're being wrong, and will you continue to be wrong, or at some point you'll be right?
Yes. Or if he's even been wrong,
Yeah.
Luigi, he may not be wrong. His timing may just be off.
Right. So I still think the debt to GDP ratio in Japan is too high, and I worry more about the fact that the Japanese government doesn't have a plan to reduce the debt to GDP ratio without relying on increased growth rate. And the reason I've been wrong for the last 15 years at least, maybe 20 years, is that the interest rate on the government debt has declined, continued to decline. So uh, I wrote a paper with Takahito in 2011. So it's 15 years ago, right? So in 2011, saying that assuming that the interest rate didn't go down and could go up, that the interest rate on the 10 years JGB was a 1.3% back then. And we didn't think it could go down. And if that doesn't go down, the amount of debt the Japanese government issues will exceed the total financial assets of the household in Japan, and that cannot happen. But what happened was the interest rate started to or continued to decline below 1% and below 0% at one point. So that made it possible for the Japanese government to continue increasing the amount of debt. Now the interest rate is rising very slowly, very slowly on short end. The Bank of Japan stopped zero interest rate policy, and now the policy interest rate is 0.5%. Long-term government bonds, 30 or 40 years, are quite high, the 3%, 4%. So I think we are in a dangerous situation now, the more dangerous than 15 years ago. But again, I could be wrong.
What does Japan's experience and your experience in being wrong tell us about how to think about a world awash in debt and a United States awash in debt? I mean, it's obviously a very timely topic. Is it that at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is the interest rate that you pay, and interest rates are somewhat the path of interest rates is somewhat unpredictable, or are there bigger lessons in this for how to think about the world's debt today?
I think a bigger lesson is what happened in Japan. I think is that the bond market believes the government eventually will do something to fix the situation, so that the current level of debt is justified. But that expectation can change very quickly.
Yeah.
But so far it hasn't changed.
So continue with my morbid metaphor. Is you always hope that the parachute will be pulled at some point as you're going down, but as you're approaching the floor, you realize that at some point you lose the hope, and by that time
Yeah.
is terrible. And
Splat.
Yes.
yes,
And by then it's too late, right?
by then it's too late. And actually, several years ago, I asked the question how this will end to a high-level official in Japan,
Mhm.
and he said with a smile, "Inflation, but don't tell anybody." So, is that inflation the only way out?
Well, I don't think even inflation is a way out, right? So the best thing inflation can do is to eliminate the existing debt. But as long as you continue to run the budget deficit, you start accumulating debt again.
But
So inflation,
how big is a primary deficit?
primary deficit,
Yeah.
it's let's see. So we are talking about the 3% of GDP or so.
So the
So it
primary
was it
deficit,
was
net of interest, without looking at interest, is 3% of GDP.
yeah, but
Wow.
maybe 2%.
Yeah.
But so it was high in 2020 because of the COVID and so on, and it declined a bit. But primary deficit is still Japan still runs quite substantial primary deficit. So it was so almost always forecast the primary deficit will come to close to zero, but every year in the last 2 or 3 years. But what happened is that's based on the initial budget number, and they always come up with, or they have been always coming up with a supplementary budget during the year in order to respond to a crisis, which has to happen every year. So the primary deficit has not been shrinking as much as they forecasted.
It's fascinating. It's like a company taking a one-time loss that's supposed to be non-recurring, so investors look through it and pretend it isn't happening. It's the
Mhm.
emergency and the government emergency that happens every year that necessitates more government spending. And at what point does
Yes,
that no
and
longer
there
become
seem to be a continuation of emergencies all over the
right?
world.
Right. Always, always. So, is there a broader lesson here? I mean, could you say that maybe austerity is never the right answer until it's the only answer? Is that the way this works with government debt?
I, yeah, I'm afraid so. Yes.
But to what extent this is a failure of the Japanese capitalist model? Because I remember when I came to the United States was 1988. Everybody was
Hmm.
scared of Japan and we're talking about a new form of capitalism, the Japanese form of capitalism, and
Hmm.
now nobody talks about that anymore. But to what extent
Right.
this is a failure of Japanese capitalism? To what extent is a failure, maybe more broadly, of capitalism? To what extent is something idiosyncratic to Japan?
I think there's certainly a failure of the idea of the Japanese capitalism, or the belief that Japan has a different capitalism which is superior to the usual capitalism. And I think that led to the conceit of the Japanese policymakers and the Japanese business people in 1980s. Many Japanese companies were really serious about learning from the US in 60s and 70s, learning or imitating the technology or maybe sometimes stealing. But around 1980s, late 1980s, when the Japanese economy was thought to be doing very well, they tend to become more domestically oriented, or they started to say, now Japan has grown and they don't have anything to learn from the Western countries, which was totally wrong. And also another thing is the Japanese government, especially the Ministry of Finance, was confident that they can fix the problems better than, say, the US regulators. We are not US financial regulators, which are totally divided and ineffective. But the Ministry of Finance has all the powers to control the financial system, so we should be okay, which wasn't the case. So I think what failed was the idea that Japan has a special, different capitalist system which works better, but they didn't really have.
So is the real lesson here that humility is always important in affairs of men and affairs of...
I would think so, yes.